Last semester in Orientation to Teaching, which most but not all of you undertook, we framed the course around the notion of teacher talk. This semester, in Education Settings and Society, we are using the lens of student talk to frame our consideration of education settings and society. So let's take a similar approach to that we took last semester. And what does Google say about student talk? Initially, the position that most of you took when you saw this screen appear in class was as talk is seen as negative in the classroom. It was seen as talking back to teachers, children getting into trouble for talking in class when they weren't meant to. Student talk is often associated with inappropriate behaviour or misbehaviour, suggesting that to manage student talk involves managing behaviour. Well, maybe. But what about encouraging students to talk about what they are learning and how they are learning? Talk in the classroom can be amazingly positive if we create a learning environment or setting where students feel safe and supported to talk about their learning, where they are engaged in interesting and challenging learning activities, and where all of them are included. We then talked about what do students talk about. Do they talk about their weekends, the football, their toys, their interests? Do they talk about anything but learning? Well, they do, and you all told me that they talk about looms fairly often. But they do talk about their learning as well. And it's the learning and talk about the learning that we want to foster in our learning settings. Why is it important to focus on student talk? Well, from a learning perspective, talking is crucial. Through our language, through talking about our learning with others, we can reinforce or clarify our understandings. Fostering students to talk about their learning is therefore a critical teaching skill. In this slide, many of you honed in on the phrase, language gives definition to our memories, permits us to pay attention to things. I thought they were terrific responses that you all gave in class about the role of language. In this slide, many of you honed in on the phrase, it's our operating system. Language is how we think. And we had a terrific discussion in both classes about the role that Lev Vygotsky played in helping us understand the role that language plays in our own learning. And that without language and the ability to express our ideas are locked in our minds. So if language is how we think, and we want our classrooms to be full of thinking, then we probably need to provide opportunities for our students to use their language. So if talk is such a fundamental element of the learning process, how do we as teachers create opportunities in the classroom for constructive and purposeful talk? This point also connects to ideas from last semester, where we thought about how much of the talk in classroom is usually teacher talk, and how few opportunities there are for students to talk. Even when the teacher asks the students to talk, it's very often to answer a question, and then it's usually only one student at a time. Opportunities for students to talk with each other about what they're learning are less common. So what do we need to do to create conditions in our classroom where students talk all the time, but about what we want them to talk about? That is, about what and how they're learning. So we turn to what the textbook says. And the textbook focuses on the creation of atmosphere, particularly an atmosphere where the children feel safe. Because unless you feel safe, it's really difficult to express what might be very ill-formed ideas. And unless we create an environment where children feel they have a voice, that they are listened to, they're more reluctant to express what those ill-formed ideas are. And learning is all about our ill-formed ideas and checking those ill-formed ideas against others who are more knowledgeable and against other perspectives. So it's really important to establish that environment in your classroom where everybody feels safe enough to talk about their thinking. I asked you before the workshop to consider What influences your talk? You read a section from the textbook that talked about the growing influence that digital media culture has on what children talk about. And I asked you to think about whether that experience was the same for you. Is digital culture influencing what you talk about? What other influences are there on what you talk about and how you've learned? Who's been those influences? I set up a today's meet for both classes, and there were some commonalities across the two campuses. It seems that family, particularly, is the strongest influence on you and your learning, on where you do your talking, but that friends and coaches and teachers also featured fairly highly. Many of you agreed that books were also important sources of your learning, and that media and culture, particularly popular culture, is also a significant influence on how you learn. It was interesting to hear the divergent views in some of the classes where, for some of you, family was that safe haven where you felt it didn't matter what you said, you'd still be listened to. For others, differences between your values and those that you feel your parents and other members of your family share have led to the situation of you relying more on your friends as the sounding board for your ideas. Regardless, you both sets of students talked about the importance of those shared values as one of the conditions for feeling safe to talk about what you're learning and what your ideas are. Those who talked about coaches and teachers emphasised the role that they had in providing some sort of structure and guidance or support for your learning. And that books, media and wider culture also play a significant role in what you learn and how you learn. We also talked about where you learn. And many of you talked about learning in the classroom. Many of you talked about learning in the bedroom. Some of you talked about learning in community groups such as sporting organisations and community organisations like Guides and Scouts and Cubs. Where you learnt in the family was also often around the family dining table. And increasingly, what came out of the Today's Meet transcripts was that many of you learn from being online, from talking with friends on Facebook to browsing through the internet to find out stuff. And increasingly, our students, even in primary schools, learn from in the same settings. It's not just the classroom where learning takes place. Indeed, most learning takes place before we get to school or beyond the school yards. So as teachers, we don't have a monopoly on influencing how, what, and when our students learn. Eventually, we came to the conclusion that some of the common elements of the environments in which you did your learning were that you felt safe enough to form those and express those ill-formed ideas, that you felt safe enough to share those ideas that were still half-cooked. You also had support from teachers or mentors or parents or coaches to guide you. A couple of the issues that we will touch on in coming lectures will be a sense of feeling included and belonging in a learning setting and of being engaged by what was being learnt. And that was something that we touched on briefly in the lecture as well. I've recommended for those who want to read further about learning environments and what's involved in establishing safe, supportive, inclusive and engaging learning settings to read pages 273 to 303 of Teaching, Making a Difference. It's a teacher education textbook and you'll find copies of it in both the Bundoora and Brunswick libraries. One of the first principles that I introduced to you was the idea of getting to know what your students talk about. And this particular blog post starts to highlight the idea of eavesdropping on children the importance of picking up what matters to them. The reason for doing this is to try to glean their interest and pick up on any ideas, though, so that projects or learning activities can be designed around the children's interests, what engages them. This is a really important idea and forms the basis of much of what you'll be doing this semester in terms of developing detailed knowledge about the students that you teach. And we will support you and scaffold you into developing learner biographies on the students that you'll be teaching when you're on placement. And it's about knowing not just what interests them, but knowing about how they learn best, who they learn best with, and where they might learn best. So that'll be a fairly significant focus this semester, is on the influences on children's talk. More on that next week. See you then.